Before we begin, consider subscribing if you haven't already. It allows us to keep exploring the ancient world with the depth and respect it deserves, following the clues left in archaeology, forgotten manuscripts, and the cultural memory of civilizations that shaped our faith. Tonight's investigation takes us to a subject that stands at the center of human history, the moment when life ends and something greater begins. Not myths, not legends, but the way ancient Israel, early Judaism, and the first followers of Jesus understood the instant the soul steps beyond the physical world and approaches what they called the threshold of judgment. To American audiences, the phrase final judgment often suggests a distant moment, something that happens at the end of time, far beyond personal experience. But to the ancient world, judgment was both immediate and ultimate. They believed that when a person dies, something begins, a process of review, clarification, and confrontation that is deeply personal, utterly honest, and impossible to escape. Yet this post-mortem encounter was never confused with the final judgment. It was preliminary, private, a threshold, and the ancient writers were clear. The final, cosmic tribunal, the one involving resurrection, nations, and the renewal of the world, has not yet occurred. Understanding this difference is the key to understanding what awaits humanity. In Second Temple Judaism, the environment of Jesus, the prophets, and the early apostles, the moment of death was described not as darkness, but as exposure. Ancient texts from the Dead Sea community, early rabbinic writings, and apocryphal literature depict a scene in which the soul is brought into clarity, not punished, not rewarded, not yet. Instead, it is shown its own life from a viewpoint it never had while alive. The early rabbis described it as a mirror held to the soul, something that reveals motives rather than only actions. Early Christians echoed the idea, speaking of conscience, hidden intentions, and unspoken decisions rising to the surface the moment earthly breath ceases. What is striking from a historical perspective is how consistent these descriptions are. Across Jewish writings from different regions, different centuries, and different social groups, the death moment is treated not as annihilation or immediate heaven-hell assignment, but as transition into evaluation. It is the beginning of something larger, something still unfolding. And this idea appears not only in religious texts, but also in the archaeological record. Inscriptions, tomb writings, and burial practices show an expectation that death initiates movement, not conclusion. The Judean desert provides extraordinary insight into this worldview. In the caves above Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were preserved for 2,000 years, we find descriptions of heavenly councils, watchers, and records. These documents don't describe a final universal trial, but individualized moments of assessment, a kind of spiritual intake process into the unseen realm. In one text, the soul is described as standing before the glory, not for condemnation, but for truthful exposure, a recognition of what one's life has actually become, stripped of self-deception and worldly noise. In early Christian literature, the same pattern appears. Followers of Jesus inherited Jewish concepts of the afterlife, emphasizing that the soul's first encounter after death is not the final verdict, but the unveiling of truth. Church fathers in the first century spoke about this moment as a private court, distinguishing it from the future public judgment involving all generations. They taught that when the body dies, the soul becomes fully conscious of its own reality, not yet resurrected, not yet judged in the cosmic sense, but fully aware, fully seen, fully understood. This creates a profound contrast with modern assumptions. Many contemporary interpretations project the final judgment directly onto the moment of death, compressing two ancient ideas into one. But the earliest Jewish and Christian sources carefully separate them. The threshold moment is immediate, personal, and internal. The final judgment is future, cosmic, and public. To understand why this mattered to ancient Israel, we must look at how they viewed life itself. To them, life was a trust, something entrusted by God, shaped by community, measured by responsibility. Every day contained moral weight. Every choice carried consequences beyond the visible. This worldview made the idea of a private judgment moment not frightening, but logical. If God is the source of life, then encountering God at life's end is inevitable. The soul enters the presence of the one who sustains existence. There, the illusions of the world fall away. Ancient Jewish literature even includes metaphors for this moment. Some writings describe it as waking from a dream. Others portray it as standing at a doorway with brilliant light on the other side, a light impossible to hide from or distort. In several texts from the Second Temple period, the soul is depicted as suddenly aware of the moral architecture of reality, the way good shapes existence, the way injustice warps it, and the way divine truth aligns all things. And yet, the same texts make something very clear. This is not the final judgment, not yet. The early rabbis emphasized that the final judgment can only occur when all generations are present, when the dead rise, when every era stands together, when humanity's intertwined stories reach their ultimate conclusion. The threshold at death is individual, the final judgment is universal. This distinction appears vividly in early Christian writings as well. Paul, John, and other early figures insisted that the final judgment involves the resurrection of the body, something that has not happened yet. For them, the final judgment requires physical restoration because justice is not complete until every dimension of human life, including the body, stands before God. Personal decisions were made through physical actions, and thus final accountability must involve the physical as well. This is why resurrection was such a central belief. Without it, final justice cannot occur. Archaeology helps illuminate this worldview. Burial practices in ancient Judea reflect a deep expectation of future resurrection. Bones were collected in ossuaries, not to preserve the dead as relics, but because families believed these remains would one day be reassembled. Excavated tombs often include inscriptions referencing rest, waiting, or expectation. Nothing suggests the belief that souls immediately entered their eternal state. Everything points to anticipation. In the threshold moment, the soul sees itself, but in the final judgment, the world sees the truth about all. Between these two events lies a vast theological landscape, one shaped by prophecy, hope, fear, and the unwavering conviction that God's justice will eventually become visible. Ancient Judaism did not fear this moment. It revered it. Christianity inherited the same reverence, teaching that judgment means restoration, clarity, and the setting right of all things. But the threshold remains personal, intimate, sometimes described as peaceful. sometimes as piercing. Early texts portray it as a moment without excuses, a moment when a person understands their life with total honesty. Some writings compare it to a courtroom where no argument is needed because the truth is self-evident. Others compare it to a harvest. What was sown in life is simply revealed in death. This was not meant to frighten ancient listeners, but to make them aware of the significance of their existence. They believed the universe is moral at its core, not indifferent, not random, but purposeful. The threshold moment was proof that life matters, every action matters, every intention matters. Yet even the most detailed ancient descriptions insist that this private moment does not replace the final judgment. It prepares the soul for it. It reveals truth so that, when the last day comes, nothing will be hidden. As we move deeper into this investigation, we will explore what ancient writers believed about the heavenly court, the cosmic prosecutor, the role of angels, the resurrection of the dead, and the verdict that will reshape the world itself. But everything begins here, at the threshold, the moment every human being crosses, and the moment every ancient tradition recognized as the beginning of divine evaluation. The final judgment has not yet arrived, but the threshold stands before every soul. In the ancient world, every society understood judgment through the lens of its own legal systems. Egypt had courts led by scribes and overseers. Mesopotamia had councils that reviewed disputes under carved stelae of royal law. Israel had elders sitting at the gates of every city, settling matters of inheritance, purity, conflict, and restitution. But above these human courts, the people of Israel believed another structure existed, a vast layered system of justice operating in the unseen realm, not mythic, not symbolic, but real. This idea forms the backbone of the ancient Jewish and early Christian worldview. Judgment happens on multiple levels. The earthly courts deal with visible matters. The heavenly courts address the hidden ones. And the final court, the one history still awaits, will address the destiny of all creation. To understand how these layers functioned in the minds of ancient writers, we must begin with the earthly courts. In ancient Israel, justice was communal. The gate of the city acted as a public courtroom, where disputes were heard before elders. Archaeological excavations of Iron Age cities reveal stone benches built into the gate structures, precisely where elders sat. Inscribed seals and administrative tablets confirm that civic judgment was routine, structured, and taken seriously. Justice was not private. It was seen. And it was understood as a reflection, a small-scale imitation, of a greater court above. This belief appears in the oldest Hebrew writings, that the divine realm mirrors earthly patterns, or rather, that earthly patterns reflect something eternal. The biblical prophets describe God surrounded by a council, a heavenly assembly where decisions are made and missions assigned. Early Jewish literature expands this idea with extraordinary detail. The Dead Sea Scrolls speak of angelic figures who stand as witnesses, recorders, and messengers. The Book of Enoch describes heavenly watchers responsible for observing human behavior not as spies, but as custodians of moral order. These texts are not presenting fantasy. They reflect a worldview in which justice is both immediate and cosmic. Ancient Jews saw human courts as temporary structures existing within a much larger legal universe, and early Christians inherited this vision completely. But here is the crucial point. Even these heavenly courts were not the final court. Ancient sources say there are judgments that happen now, continuously, and a judgment that has not yet opened. The final one, the ultimate one, requires conditions history has not yet reached. To see how the ancient world understood this, consider the idea of the heavenly record. In Jewish tradition, God was believed to keep not only a list of actions, but a moral accounting. Motives, opportunities, choices taken and not taken. Writings from the Second Temple period describe these records in symbolic language because they had no other way to express the idea that truth itself was preserved. Modern readers sometimes imagine literal books made of parchment, but the ancient writers did not think in physical terms. They used the concept of writing as a metaphor for permanence. Anything written, sealed, preserved, was unchangeable. Therefore, the books of heaven represented the unalterable truth of a life. Early rabbis compared the divine record to memory taken to its highest possible accuracy. Nothing lost, nothing exaggerated, nothing distorted. This is the first level of the heavenly court, the level of truth-keeping, not verdicts, not sentences, just record. Above this level, ancient texts describe another, the reviewing court. This is where the threshold judgment discussed in Part 1 occurs. When a person dies, the soul encounters the truth preserved about it. This is personal review, not cosmic decision. It is the private chamber, the moment the soul sees itself clearly and recognizes the shape of its life. But even here, the process does not end. Early Jewish writings speak of another layer, what some texts call the Council of Holiness, a gathering of angelic beings who observe the moral unfolding of human history. This council is described as deliberative, meaning it evaluates the flow of events and the movements of nations. It is not final judgment, but ongoing oversight. The prophets often refer to this council indirectly. When Isaiah describes a vision of the divine throne, he sees seraphim calling out the holiness of God. When Micaiah describes a scene of the heavenly assembly, he speaks of spiritual beings discussing how to influence earthly rulers. These passages reveal an organized structure, not chaos, not mysticism, but a hierarchy of responsibility. Still, these are not the highest layers. To reach the top of the ancient system, we must examine the apocalyptic literature, writings produced in times of crisis when people longed for divine intervention. These works, such as Enoch, 2 Esdras, and certain Dead Sea Scroll texts, describe the ultimate court, thrones set in place, a central throne blazing with impossible brightness, and tens of thousands standing as attendants. This imagery is not intended to intimidate, but to convey total authority. In these visions, the final court is described as a public tribunal, not for one person or one generation, but for all of humanity across all time. This court does not operate now. It has not opened. According to ancient writers, it cannot open until all the dead are raised, all generations stand together. History has completed its course. Only then can the final court convene. This understanding is central to Jewish and Christian theology. The resurrection is necessary not merely to give people eternal life, but to bring them to judgment in a complete form. Body and soul reunited. Early Christian thinkers argued that final justice requires embodiment, because human actions were embodied. Without the resurrection, final judgment would be incomplete, lacking the full context of how people lived, harmed, healed, built, or destroyed. Here, We also encounter the role of the accuser, a figure sometimes misunderstood in modern culture. In ancient Jewish thought, the Satan was not initially a rival deity or an independent force, but a legal role, a prosecuting figure permitted to bring accusations in the heavenly court. This role appears in early texts as one who tests, challenges, or exposes. But the ancient writers insist that even the accuser operates under divine boundaries. The heavenly courts are not scenes of cosmic conflict between equal forces. They are courts, structured and ordered. As time progressed, and as apocalyptic literature developed, the figure of the accuser became associated with cosmic rebellion. Early Christian writings describe a moment still ahead, a final appeal, a last accusation against humanity before the accuser is expelled permanently from the heavenly court. But that event has not yet occurred. The final court has not yet opened. Knowing this helps make sense of a pattern that appears throughout Scripture and ancient commentary, the tension between the present age and the age to come. Ancient Jews understood themselves as living between courts, accountable daily, reviewed at death, but awaiting the day when God brings history into full light. This perspective shaped their ethics, their worship, and their hope. Early Christians continued this worldview, teaching that believers live under ongoing heavenly review. But ultimate judgment awaits the resurrection. Archaeology reinforces this layered understanding. Inscriptions from Judea refer to God as judge of the world, but they also mention present judgments, droughts, victories, losses, interpreted as divine responses to moral conditions. Burial inscriptions speak of hope, not in immediate heavenly reward, but in the future raising of the dead. The physical evidence mirrors the textual claims. So, what does this tell us about the final judgment? It tells us that the ancient world saw judgment not as a single event, but as a structure, a progression, a sequence that moves from individual truth to cosmic truth. It tells us that humanity is already under a form of review, but the verdict of history has not yet been issued. The court above the courts is not a place, but a system. Truth preserved, truth revealed to the individual, truth evaluated by heavenly observers, truth finally declared before all creation. The final step, the one the prophets and early Christians described with awe and trembling, has not yet taken place. But everything in ancient literature points to it approaching. In the next section, we will explore the books of remembrance, the ancient concept of moral records preserved in the divine realm, and how these archives form the foundation of the coming final judgment. In every ancient culture, record-keeping represented permanence. Clay tablets in Mesopotamia, temple inscriptions in Egypt, and administrative scrolls in Israel all carried the same meaning. Once something was written, it could not be ignored. It became part of the public memory of a society. But ancient Israel believed something even more profound, that beyond human archives existed a deeper, more perfect record, a moral record, a spiritual record, a record that could not be altered, erased, bribed, or misinterpreted. This idea appears throughout early Jewish literature, and it forms one of the central foundations of the final judgment. These divine archives were known as the books of remembrance, not because God needed books to remember, but because ancient people needed a metaphor strong enough to express the idea that nothing escapes the attention of the moral universe. To modern audiences, the phrase books of heaven might suggest literal volumes bound in leather. But for ancient Jews, book meant something closer to unchangeable record. Writing was permanence. Writing was authority. Writing was witness. So, when the prophets, sages, and early Christian writers spoke of heavenly books, they were expressing the belief that every life leaves a permanent imprint, a moral footprint preserved beyond forgetting. To understand how this concept developed, we must step into the world of the ancient Near East. In Israel's time, kings kept annals, detailed, chronological records of events, victories, losses, and legal decisions. Archaeologists have recovered royal inscriptions from Assyria, Babylon, and Egypt, describing campaigns, conquests, and judgments. These inscriptions serve not only as historical accounts, but also as moral statements. They preserve the deeds of rulers for generations. Israel adopted this pattern, but transformed it. For Israel, history belonged not to kings, but to God. The prophets declared that God observed the actions of nations, recorded their injustices, and held them accountable. While Assyrian kings carved their triumphs into stone, Israel believed that God recorded the truth about nations and individuals alike, truth that could never be distorted by propaganda or political power. This belief appears vividly in ancient texts. Jewish writings speak of books opened before the Holy One, records containing not only actions, but intentions. The sages taught that what mattered most was not simply what people did, but what they meant. A generous deed done for selfish praise was different from a quiet act of kindness. A harmful act done in ignorance had a different moral weight from one done with deliberation. These distinctions required a kind of record far more precise than human courts could keep. And so the books of remembrance became a core part of Jewish spiritual imagination, not fantasy, not myth, a theological statement. Justice requires memory, and perfect justice requires perfect memory. The Dead Sea Scrolls provide remarkable insight into this concept. Among the scrolls discovered at Qumran, several texts describe angels whose purpose is to observe and record. These observers are not sentries spying on humanity, but custodians of moral order. In one scroll, the deeds of the righteous are said to shine before the Eternal One, while the deeds of the wicked accuse them without voice. These statements do not portray a courtroom scene, but a cosmic moral system in which truth naturally rises and falsehood naturally condemns. What makes these texts so compelling is how they align with archaeological reality. In ancient Israel, scribes were among the most respected figures in society. They preserved genealogies, legal decisions, temple instructions, and national history. Their work symbolized accuracy and responsibility. When Jewish writers spoke of heavenly scribes recording human deeds, they were not imagining fantasy beings, but elevating the role of the earthly scribe into the moral realm. Early Christian writings continue this theme with striking consistency. Jesus speaks of every careless word having weight. Paul describes conscience acting as a witness, a kind of internal recorder reflecting the heavenly record. Early Christian theologians interpreted these ideas to mean that the books of remembrance were not external documents, but expressions of divine justice woven into the fabric of existence. One of the most profound ideas found in early Jewish mysticism is that the universe itself bears witness. According to several ancient texts, Creation was designed with moral sensitivity. Actions carve pathways, choices leave impressions. Nothing done in time is lost to eternity, even if forgotten by human minds. This belief was not meant to intimidate, but to dignify human life. Every moment mattered. Every decision shaped reality. In one ancient Jewish commentary, the books of remembrance are described as the echo of the soul's choices. Another text says that a person writes their own story through their deeds, a story they will one day read in the presence of the divine. The imagery is poetic, but the concept is concrete. The final judgment is not arbitrary. It is the unveiling of truth long preserved. To understand this better, imagine the difference between a courtroom relying on eyewitness testimony, flawed, biased, limited by memory, and a courtroom with perfect documentation. That is what ancient people believed the heavenly court possessed, perfect documentation. But the books of remembrance contain more than deeds. They include intentions, why a person chose what they chose, opportunities, what good they could have done but refused, responses, how they treated others in moments of power or vulnerability, consequences, the ripple effects of their actions across communities, generations, even nations. In ancient Jewish thought, these ripples of consequence mattered tremendously. A harmful decision made by one person could injure others long after the person died. A good decision could bless generations yet unborn. The books of remembrance, therefore, contain not only actions, but the long-term impact of those actions, the moral network woven by every life. Early Christian teachers expanded this view. They taught that human lives create legacies, and those legacies become part of the final evaluation. The moral imprint of a person continues after death. Their influence, for good or ill, becomes part of the record. The early church saw this not as fear-mongering, but as reality. What we do shapes the world beyond our lifespan. This brings us to an essential insight. The books of remembrance make final judgment possible. Without perfect memory, justice cannot be complete. Without perfect understanding of motives and consequences, judgment risks being superficial. The ancient writers recognized this. They insisted that God's justice is perfect because God's memory is perfect. But these books are not opened at death. They are only revealed. The final opening, the public opening, awaits the cosmic tribunal discussed later in this story. This distinction mattered deeply to ancient Jews. They believed the books would not be opened until all humanity stood together, because only in that universal gathering could the full story of history be understood. A harmful decision made in one century might have its consequences in another. A virtuous act in one generation might bear fruit centuries later. The final judgment, therefore, must involve the entire human story, not just individuals, but nations, cultures, and civilizations. The books of remembrance ensure that nothing is lost, nothing is hidden, nothing is misrepresented. In several ancient texts, the image of the opened books appears at the moment when cosmic justice begins, when humanity stands resurrected and history is laid bare. These books do not condemn arbitrarily, they simply reveal, and revelation itself becomes judgment. When every truth is unveiled, every illusion collapses, every justification evaporates, every motive becomes clear. It is crucial to emphasize that ancient Jews and Christians did not see this as terror. They saw it as hope. A world without perfect memory is a world where victims can be forgotten, injustices erased, and corruption buried. The books of remembrance guaranteed that this could never happen. They ensured that those who suffered in silence would be remembered, and those who hid their wrongdoing behind power or privilege could never escape accountability. This belief was radical in the ancient world. Many cultures accepted that injustice prevailed and that the powerful died unpunished. Israel rejected that despair. Early Christianity rejected it as well. Both traditions proclaimed that the moral record is preserved by a God who forgets nothing and overlooks no one. The books of remembrance were not intended to frighten. They were intended to assure. They were the promise that ultimate justice is not a dream, but a certainty. In the next section, we turn to one of the most dramatic elements of this heavenly system, the role of the accuser, the prosecuting figure whose final confrontation with humanity has not yet taken place. To understand the final judgment, we must confront one of the most misunderstood figures in the entire biblical world, the accuser. Modern imagination often reshapes him into a horned villain, a mythic tyrant ruling an underworld or battling God as an equal. None of that reflects the ancient sources. The earliest Jewish and Christian writings present him not as a rival God, but as a legal role, a permitted adversary, a prosecutor in the heavenly court, whose authority is tightly limited. The Hebrew term translated Satan originally functions as a title, not a name. It means the accuser, the challenger, or the one who opposes in court. It is a role found in earthly courts as well, the figure who brings charges, not out of personal hatred, but as part of the system of justice. Understanding this legal framework is essential because it shapes everything about how ancient Jews and early Christians saw spiritual conflict, moral accountability, and the approaching final judgment. In the earliest biblical writings, the accuser appears as a member of the heavenly council, a being permitted to raise questions about human motives, not because God needs information, but because the moral integrity of creation demands examination. The ancient world saw this as normal, just as a king's court included advisors with different responsibilities. The heavenly court included figures with investigative authority. But unlike earthly prosecutors, the accuser operated under strict boundaries. He could not act on his own authority. He required permission. He could only accuse on the basis of truth. This is where the ancient worldview diverges sharply from modern depictions. The accuser was not originally an embodiment of evil. He was a tester, one who exposes motives, challenges surface righteousness, and confronts self-deception. Early Jewish writings describe him as the one who searches the hearts of men, not by personal insight, but by provoking situations that reveal what lies beneath. Yet the ancient texts also reveal something else. This role is temporary. The accuser is not eternal. His function exists only within the current structure of the heavenly court, and early Jewish and Christian writers speak of a moment when this figure will make a final, last appeal, a final accusation against humanity, before being removed permanently from the court of heaven. To understand why, we must explore how the role of the accuser evolved over centuries. In the earliest layers of Scripture, the accuser is a permitted challenger. But as Jewish literature developed, especially during the Second Temple period, the figure became associated with cosmic rebellion. Some apocryphal writings describe angelic beings who abandoned their assigned roles, crossing boundaries set by God. These texts do not present mythic battles of gods versus demons. They present order versus disorder, obedience versus rebellion. One of the most influential writings of this period, the Book of Enoch, describes a group of angels who violate divine boundaries, bringing corruption into human societies. This story, while expressed in symbolic language, reflects deep concerns of the ancient world, the fear that spiritual or cosmic order could be disrupted by beings who misuse their authority. It also reflects the belief that chaos in the human world often begins with rebellion in the unseen realm. Ancient Jews did not view evil as an independent power, but as disorder, a tearing of the fabric of creation. In this literature, the accuser becomes associated with this cosmic disorder. He is not responsible for all evil. Ancient Jews never believed that. But he becomes the embodiment of accusation, opposition, and the desire to undermine human righteousness. His purpose shifts from testing to destroying. Instead of merely challenging motives, he seeks to condemn humanity entirely. Early Christians inherited this view, but sharpened it. They described the accuser as a figure whose time is running out, whose access to the heavenly court is temporary, and whose final removal will occur shortly before the final judgment. They believed that one day the accuser's authority to prosecute humanity would end. That final moment, his last appeal, is one of the most dramatic scenes in ancient apocalyptic thought. This is not myth. It is the ancient legal imagination applied to cosmic justice. Think of it this way. If the final judgment is the supreme court of all creation, then every prosecutor has a final opportunity to present their case before the record is closed forever. The accuser, whose role has been to challenge human loyalty and expose human failure, brings one last accusation against humanity as a whole. But ancient writings insist on something remarkable. This final accusation will fail, not because humanity is innocent, not because the accuser lacks evidence, but because the structure of the moral universe changes when resurrection comes. Ancient Jews believed that resurrection marks the beginning of a new age, an age in which death, corruption, and spiritual rebellion lose their power. The accuser's authority depends on the presence of sin, suffering, and incomplete justice. Once God begins the process of restoring creation, once the dead rise, once the world begins to shift toward renewal, the accuser's role becomes obsolete. He is dismissed, removed, permanently barred from the heavenly council. Some early Christian writers described this as a moment of cosmic cleansing, not a battle, not a war, but a legal transition. The accuser is no longer permitted to bring charges. The heavenly court proceeds without him. Humanity stands before God without a prosecutor. And that, paradoxically, makes judgment more severe, not less. Because in ancient thought, the accuser's removal means humanity must face the truth of the books of remembrance without mediation, without argument, without defense. This concept appears symbolically in several ancient texts as the casting down of the accuser. Not physically thrown downward, but legally expelled, stripped of the right to appear in the court of heaven. His presence, once tolerated for the sake of moral clarity, is no longer necessary. The record stands complete. Humanity will face God directly. But before that moment, Ancient writings suggest a period of intensified accusation, a final attempt to undermine humanity. This is the last appeal. In Jewish apocalyptic thought, this period is marked by confusion, corruption, and moral testing. Not supernatural chaos, but profound ethical crisis. People deceive and are deceived. Justice is distorted. Truth is blurred. The accuser brings his case not through supernatural terror, but through the collapse of moral clarity. Early Christians interpreted these ideas as signs of spiritual and societal disorder in the last days. They believed the accuser's influence would peak before his removal, but they also believed that his final attempt to condemn humanity would be overturned by God's intervention. This leads us to an essential insight about the ancient world view. The accuser exists for a purpose, but that purpose is temporary. His role is allowed for the sake of moral exposure. Humans often deceive themselves. They justify wrongdoing. They hide their motives. The accuser forces confrontation. He tests, challenges, and exposes, not because he seeks truth, but because he seeks condemnation. Yet the result, exposure, serves the cause of justice. When final judgment comes, this exposure is complete. No further accusation is necessary. The role dissolves. The accuser is expelled, and the heavenly court proceeds without opposition. Archaeology gives us unexpected insight into this concept. In ancient inscriptions from Israel and surrounding nations, the idea of courtroom adversaries appears frequently. These adversaries are not personal enemies, but legal opponents. They challenge, question, and confront. In some texts, the adversary loses his place when the king issues a final verdict. This earthly pattern mirrors the heavenly concept. The role of challenger is temporary. The role of the judge is permanent. Understanding this ancient pattern allows us to see the final judgment in a new light. It is not a cosmic struggle between equal forces. It is a legal process moving steadily toward its conclusion. The accuser's last appeal marks the end of the old order, the order of testing, failure, and spiritual conflict. The resurrection marks the beginning of the new order, the order of clarity, restoration, and irreversible justice. As we turn to the next section, we will explore the figure at the center of this transition, the judge who returns, not symbolically, not metaphorically, but in the full authority described by ancient prophets and early Christian witness. The accuser's last appeal signals the closing of the court's preliminary phase. The judge's return signals the opening of the final one. In every ancient civilization, justice ultimately depended on the presence of a judge, someone with the authority to interpret law, weigh evidence, and pronounce verdicts that shaped the destiny of entire communities. But in ancient Israel, the idea of a judge extended far beyond the human world. The judge was not merely a role, it was a title of divine authority. And throughout Jewish and early Christian literature, one theme appears again and again. A moment is coming when the judge will return, not in secret, not symbolically, but in a form visible to all. This belief did not emerge suddenly. It developed gradually across centuries of prophetic writing, national suffering, foreign occupations, and spiritual longing. Ancient Israel believed that God had acted as judge during key moments in history, delivering the oppressed, confronting the arrogant, and restoring what injustice had torn apart. But they also believed that the greatest act of judgment had not yet occurred. It remained ahead at the end of the current age. To understand this belief, we must first step into the prophetic imagination of the ancient world. The Hebrew prophets did not speak of judgment as mere punishment. They described it as revelation, the moment when God removes the veil from the human story. They spoke of the day not as a span of hours, but as an event laden with divine presence. When the judge returns, they said, everything hidden will become visible, and everything broken will be restored. This return was not expected to be quiet or private. It would be unmistakable, universal. The prophets used imagery rooted in their own environment: mountains trembling, skies darkened, nations gathered, rivers drying, forests shaking, not to describe natural disasters, but to express overwhelming divine arrival. When the judge comes, the prophets insisted, creation itself responds. But the most remarkable part of their teaching is this: the judge does not appear until the final courtroom is ready. In other words, the return of the judge requires the resurrection of the dead, the gathering of nations, and the opening of the books of remembrance. These prerequisites make clear that the ultimate judgment is not about individual souls drifting upward at death. It is about the transformation of the entire human world. To American audiences, the idea of a divine judge returning in glory may feel distant, abstract, or overly symbolic. But to ancient Jews and early Christians, it was the anchor of their hope. They believed that history is not an endless cycle of empires rising and falling. They believed history is moving steadily, purposefully, toward an appointed moment when justice finally becomes visible. And that visibility is key. Ancient Jews never believed God's judgment was primarily internal or private. They expected a public revelation involving nations, kings, common people, ancestors, future generations, everyone. A verdict spoken in the presence of the entire human family. That public dimension is essential to understanding the final judgment. Let's explore how ancient writers described the judge's return. In Jewish literature from the Second Temple period, the judge is portrayed as radiant, overwhelming, and terrifying only to those who cling to injustice, not because the judge is cruel, but because truth itself is unbearable to hardened hearts. These texts speak of a presence that exposes all deceit, a brightness that burns away illusion, a voice that shatters denial. In early Christian writings, this figure becomes even more defined. The judge is described as the one who has authority over the living and the dead, the one who brings resurrection, the one who confronts every earthly power. Early Christians insisted that the return of the judge is not metaphorical. It is physical, visible, public. They rejected the idea that history simply drifts into decline. They believed history ends in a moment of divine intervention, not the collapse of the world, but its unveiling. This unveiling is central. When the judge returns, the hidden structures of the universe become visible. The heavenly court becomes public. The moral record is opened. The accuser is dismissed. The righteous shine. The wicked are exposed. This was the worldview of the earliest Christian communities, not shaped by medieval imagination, but rooted deeply in Jewish tradition. But why did ancient writers insist so strongly on the visibility of the judge? Because justice must be seen to be complete. Private justice cannot heal a wounded world. Victims must see vindication. Tyrants must see accountability. Nations must witness the truth of their histories. Humanity must understand the consequences of its collective choices. The ancient world knew this intuitively. Justice seen is justice fulfilled. Archaeology gives us further insight. Throughout Israel, judges' seats have been uncovered, stone platforms at the city gates, where verdicts were pronounced publicly. These structures were designed so that the entire community could witness judgment. The judge's presence was central. Without the judge physically present, there was no verdict. This cultural reality shaped the expectation that God himself would one day take the seat of judgment visibly before all. In apocalyptic texts, this moment is described in striking imagery. Thrones set in place, a sea of humanity gathered, angels in attendance, the judge descending with authority no power can resist. These images are not meant to terrify. They are meant to convey overwhelming clarity. Nothing is hidden. Nothing is ambiguous. Nothing is negotiable. The judge's return marks the end of the old creation and the beginning of the new. This is why early Christians spoke of the judge as both terrifying and hopeful. Terrifying to those who built their lives on oppression. Hopeful to those who suffered without justice. In early Christian preaching, the return of the judge was not primarily a warning. It was a promise that the world's injustices would not stand forever, a promise that God would not allow evil to write the final chapter. But there is another dimension to this belief, one often forgotten in modern discussions. The judge returns not only to condemn, but to restore. Ancient Jews believed that when God judges, he also heals. Judgment and restoration are two sides of the same act. Punishment, when described, is not sadistic but corrective, the removal of evil so that life can flourish. The judge does not arrive to destroy creation, but to cleanse it. Early Christians expanded this theme. They described the judge as the one who renews the earth, who brings resurrection, who restores what injustice has damaged, and who ushers in an age where death, violence, and corruption no longer exist. Their writings are filled with images of renewal, not escape, not annihilation, but transformation. This distinction is crucial. Ancient Jews and early Christians were not longing for the end of the world. They were longing for the world's redemption. The return of the judge was the doorway to that redemption. It meant that history was not meaningless. It meant that suffering was not forgotten. It meant that everything broken would be made whole. A final theme appears repeatedly in early Jewish and Christian texts. The judge returns in the same world that humanity corrupted. He does not judge from afar. He enters history. He steps into the human experience. He confronts evil on its own ground. This demonstrates that divine justice is not abstract. It is intimate, personal, embodied. Now, as we move toward the next part of the story, the ancient worldview leads us to a profound question. If the judge returns publicly, visibly, and physically, what must happen before that moment? The ancient answer is clear. The dead must rise. Because the final judgment is not merely about souls. It is about human beings as they were created to be. Body and soul together. And so, the next part of our investigation leads us into one of the most dramatic beliefs in the ancient world, the resurrection and the reassembled world. To understand the final judgment in its ancient context, we must arrive at a belief so central, so foundational, so essential to Jewish and early Christian identity that without it, the entire concept of judgment collapses. The resurrection of the dead. not a metaphor, not a spiritual awakening, not the survival of the soul in an immaterial heaven, but a physical, embodied resurrection, the reassembling of human life in its fullness. Modern audiences often struggle with this idea, imagining it as symbolic or mythic. But to ancient Jews, resurrection was neither fantasy nor metaphor. It was the only way true justice could be accomplished. If God is to judge humanity, then humans must stand before him in the form in which they lived, acted, and shaped the world. Justice requires embodiment because human actions were embodied. This conviction runs through the entirety of Jewish history, but it becomes most vivid during the Second Temple period, the era that shaped the worldview of Jesus, his disciples, and the early church. During this era, marked by foreign domination, cultural upheaval, and the longing for divine intervention, resurrection became the great hope of the oppressed. It was the promise that God would restore what evil, empire, and death had taken. To understand why resurrection mattered so deeply, we must begin with the ancient Jewish understanding of the human person. Unlike many pagan cultures of the Mediterranean world, Israel never believed that the soul was trapped inside the body or that the body was a prison. They believed humans were a unified whole. The body was not disposable. It was sacred. It was created by God. It was part of human identity. Therefore, any final judgment that excluded the body would be incomplete, partial, unjust. This belief shaped burial customs across ancient Israel. Archaeologists have discovered stone tombs, carved chambers, and bone boxes, ossuaries, that reveal an extraordinary pattern. Families would bury their loved ones in caves, allow the flesh to decompose naturally, then return later to collect the bones and place them in ossuaries. This practice was not primarily about hygiene or storage. It was theological. Bones symbolize the enduring identity of the person. They were preserved intentionally because they were expected to be reassembled by God in the final resurrection. Inscriptions on ossuaries echo this hope. Some refer to resting until the end, or awaiting the time of awakening. Nothing in these inscriptions reflects the belief that the soul escapes physicality permanently. Everything points to expectation, anticipation of a future moment when the physical world would be renewed and the dead restored. This resurrection was not believed to occur privately at death. It was a collective event, one that would take place at the end of the age. It required the dead of every generation. It required the judge's return. It required the opening of the heavenly court. This belief is confirmed by the Dead Sea Scrolls, early rabbinic writings, apocalyptic texts like 2 Esdras, and early Christian sources alike. Everywhere we look, the same pattern appears. Resurrection is public, physical, and universal. But the ancient concept of resurrection was not merely about bodies rising from the earth. It was about the reassembly of the world. Ancient Jews believed that human death was not the only fracture in creation. They believed the world itself had been damaged by violence, corruption, idolatry, and injustice. Oppressive empires had risen and fallen. Innocent blood had soaked into the land. Communities had been scattered. Civilizations had collapsed. The world bore wounds. Resurrection, therefore, was part of a larger process, the healing of creation. The prophets described a restored world in rich symbolic language. Deserts blooming, nations reconciled, predators losing their violence, rivers flowing with life. These images were not meant to describe ecological change, but moral restoration. The prophets envisioned a world returned to the state God intended from the beginning, a world without domination, fear, or death. Early Christians inherited all of this. They believed resurrection was the beginning of a new creation. They described it as the moment when mortality would be swallowed by life, when corruption would be replaced by incorruptibility, when human beings would be transformed without losing their identity. Their writings emphasized continuity, the same person restored, and transformation, the same person elevated into a renewed mode of existence. This belief also explains why early Christians insisted that Jesus himself was raised physically. They were not attempting to invent a myth or craft a theological symbol. They were making a historical claim rooted in their hope for the future. If resurrection is real, they argued, it must begin somewhere. And if resurrection marks the beginning of the new creation, then someone must stand as the first fruits, the first resurrected one, the first reassembled human, the first to step into the future age. But this focus on Jesus' resurrection was not isolated from the broader Jewish worldview. It aligned perfectly with it. Ancient Jews expected a resurrected figure at the end of the age. A leader, a king, a representative of humanity restored. Early Christians simply identified that figure and argued that resurrection had begun ahead of schedule, guaranteeing the resurrection of all. Now, consider how this connects to judgment. If the final judgment is public, cosmic, and embodied, then resurrection is its stage. Without resurrection, the final judgment cannot occur. Souls alone cannot be judged for actions performed through bodies. Justice requires the whole person. And so, resurrection becomes the great equalizer of history. Kings and beggars, soldiers and victims, tyrants and martyrs, all rise. No one hides behind time, privilege, or anonymity. Every human life reappears in the same human form in which it lived. But resurrection also equalizes suffering. In the ancient world, the righteous often died without justice. Victims were silenced. Oppressors died peacefully in their palaces. Israel lived through centuries of imperial domination, Assyrian devastation, Babylonian exile, Persian rule, Greek oppression, Roman occupation. Resurrection was the promise that God would overturn the injustices of history by restoring every victim and confronting every oppressor in the same arena. Ancient Jews did not crave revenge. They craved restoration. They longed for a world where the suffering of the innocent would be answered, where the dignity of the oppressed would be honored, and where the deeds of the wicked would be revealed. Resurrection was the doorway into that world. This is also why resurrection was not imagined as a ghostly existence floating in a spiritual realm. It was physical, tangible, but transformed. Early Christian writers described resurrected bodies as imperishable, uncorrupted, immune to death, not fragile, not vulnerable, not temporary. These were not the bodies of the current world, but the bodies of the world to come, bodies fit for a renewed creation where death no longer reigns. Ancient Jewish texts also speak of creation being renewed alongside humanity. Mountains lowered, valleys raised, rivers purified, animal hostility ended, nations taught justice. These descriptions are symbolic. They express moral and spiritual transformation through physical imagery. But they reveal how ancient people viewed resurrection, not just as the raising of bodies, but as the recreation of the world. In this worldview, Resurrection is not an isolated miracle. It is the beginning of the new age. It is the moment the current world ends and the restored world begins. But resurrection also has another function. It prepares humanity for the final court. Only once the dead rise can the books of remembrance be opened. Only once humanity stands together can truth be revealed in full. Only once body and soul reunite can the judge return. Everything converges at resurrection. Archaeology confirms the centrality of this belief. Jewish tombs throughout Israel bear inscriptions expressing hope in future life. Ossuaries reflect careful preservation of identity. Ancient prayers speak of awakening, rising, being gathered with ancestors. Even the physical layout of cemeteries, often oriented toward Jerusalem, reflects resurrection hope. This brings us to the next phase of the ancient worldview, the opening of the final court. Once resurrection occurs, once the human family is reassembled, the divine tribunal can finally convene. And that moment is described with unmatched intensity in ancient literature. Thrones set in place, witnesses summoned, records opened, nations gathered, a cosmic courtroom unlike anything the world has known. Resurrection prepares the world for judgment. Judgment prepares the world for renewal. And so, in the next part, we enter the great courtroom itself, the opening of the final tribunal awaited by prophets, poets, sages, and early believers for millennia. When ancient Jewish and early Christian writers described the final judgment, they did not imagine a chaotic scene or a private spiritual experience. They imagined a courtroom, a vast, ordered, structured tribunal where every part of the moral universe is brought into alignment. They believed that God is not only creator, but judge. Not only judge, but king. Not only king, but the one before whom all nations must eventually stand. And this courtroom, they insisted, does not open until the moment of resurrection. Everything we have explored so far, the books of remembrance, the accuser's diminishing role, the return of the judge, the resurrection of the dead, leads to this moment. The prophets, sages, and early Christian witnesses all speak of a time when the heavenly court, operating since the foundation of creation, shifts into its final phase. This phase is not hidden, it is not symbolic, it is visible, universal, irresistible. To understand what the opening of the court meant to ancient people, we must understand how courts functioned in their own societies. In ancient Israel, courtrooms were not sealed chambers or private legal offices. They were public. Entire communities gathered at the city gate, the place of trade, debate, judgment, and ritual. The judge sat on a raised platform or stone seat. Witnesses stood before him. The people listened. Verdicts were pronounced openly, often echoing through the courtyard. This openness was more than legal procedure. It was moral theater. Justice needed to be seen, because justice seen transforms society. A secret verdict changes little. A witnessed verdict shapes generations. This principle carried upward into the spiritual world. If God is to judge humanity, that judgment must be witnessed by all. It must be public in the truest sense, visible across time, history, and creation. Ancient prophets used vivid imagery to describe the moment the final court opens. They spoke of thrones arranged in order, of a central throne blazing with brightness, of heavenly beings attending like court officers. These descriptions draw from the political realities of the ancient Near East, where kings held tribunals surrounded by advisors, scribes, guards, and heralds. The prophets took this familiar structure and expanded it into cosmic scale. In one prophetic vision, the heavenly court is described as a place where thousands upon thousands stand in attendance, and 10,000 times 10,000 stand before the judge. This is not exaggeration for effect. It is the ancient way of saying the entire created order gathers here. No nation is absent. No generation is missing. No era is overlooked. The early Jewish sage known as Ezra, preserved in the apocryphal text cited, Esdras, describes the final court not as a metaphor, but as a literal event in the future of humanity. He speaks of the dead rising and the world standing still as the judge takes his seat. In his vision, the skies roll back, revealing the unseen realm. This is not destruction. It is unveiling. The world does not explode. It opens. What was hidden becomes visible. This unveiling is central to the ancient understanding of judgment. According to Jewish thought, the final court does not gather to discover truth. It gathers to reveal it. The books of remembrance contain every life, every motive, every consequence. Nothing needs to be investigated. Nothing needs to be argued. The final court opens not to collect evidence, but to present it. To put it in modern terms, the heavenly court is not a trial of investigation. It is a reading of the verdict based on the perfect moral record. And this record, ancient Jews insisted, already exists. The opening of the court is the moment the record becomes visible to angels, to humanity, to nations, to rulers, to the resurrected multitudes. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain references to a judgment of the sons of light and a visitation upon the sons of darkness, not referring to literal factions, but symbolic descriptions of righteousness and injustice. These writings speak of heavenly assemblies preparing for the final day, when the divine throne will be revealed and the court will begin its work. One remarkable Qumran text, sometimes referred to as the War Scroll, describes the divine court opening in tandem with earthly events. The overthrow of oppressive powers, the purification of the land, the restoration of covenant loyalty. While symbolic and militaristic in tone, the underlying idea is consistent across Jewish literature. The final judgment is both cosmic and terrestrial. Heaven and earth converge. The boundary between visible and invisible dissolves. Early Christian writings maintain the same structure. They describe the judge seated, heavenly beings attending, the dead resurrected, nations assembled, and the books opened. In these writings, the opening of the court is also connected to transformation, the renewal of the world. Early Christians believed that the world itself stands trial, not for condemnation, but for restoration. The old order, the order dominated by corruption, injustice, violence, and death, is dissolved. A new order begins. This new order is not purely spiritual. It is physical, historical, and communal. Ancient writers imagined a world where wrongs are righted, where justice is not merely declared but lived, where nations are taught peace, where creation is healed. The final judgment is not the end of creation. It is the beginning of its renewal. Let's examine the structure of the final court as ancient writers understood it. 1. The judge arrives. The return of the judge marks the end of delay. The prophets described him arriving with authority, not in secrecy. His presence signals the opening of the court. 2. Thrones are set. Apocalyptic literature describes a central throne surrounded by countless thrones, not a council of rival powers, but a court of attendants and witnesses. This image mirrors ancient royal courts, where lesser officials surrounded the king. 3. The dead rise. Humanity cannot be judged until the dead are restored. Resurrection brings every generation into the same moment. No one is missing. No case is incomplete. 4. The books are opened. The moral record is unveiled. What was hidden in private is revealed in public. Every life becomes transparent, not to humiliate, but to expose truth. 5. The accuser is removed. As explored earlier, the prosecuting figure makes his final appeal before being expelled. Judgment proceeds without opposition. 6. Witnesses are called, not human witnesses, not prophets. The witnesses are the heavenly beings who observed history, the record of deeds itself, and creation, which bears the scars of human action. 7. The verdict is pronounced. Judgment is not merely about punishment, it is about restoration. Those aligned with injustice face separation. Those aligned with righteousness enter the renewed world. Now, let's examine one of the most important differences between ancient and modern views of judgment. The final court is not about sorting people into heaven and hell. That framework developed much later and is shaped as much by medieval imagery as by Scripture. In ancient Jewish and early Christian thought, the final judgment is about unveiling truth, restoring creation, and establishing a renewed order. The ancient view is far more relational, ethical, and restorative. Punishment, when mentioned, is always tied to justice, not arbitrary wrath. Ancient Jews believed God's judgment removes evil the way a surgeon removes disease. It is not destruction for pleasure, it is purification for the sake of life. In early Christian texts, this idea becomes even more explicit. The ultimate goal of judgment is new creation, where tears are wiped away. Death loses its power, and suffering is no more. The opening of the court is not equal to the final verdict. It is the beginning of the process. The early Jewish imagination saw this moment as the climax of history, the point where time meets eternity, where past and future converge. Early Christians saw it as the moment when the world finally becomes what it was meant to be. Archaeological discoveries help illuminate how ancient people imagined this event. Inscriptions from Jewish tombs in Jerusalem refer to God as the one who raises the dead and the judge of all flesh. Synagogue mosaics from late antiquity depict thrones, courts, and heavenly assemblies. Even civic architecture, city gates, judgment seats, public squares, shaped how Jews imagined divine justice. The opening of the court is not chaos, it is order, it is clarity, it is truth becoming visible. And it leads us toward the next phase of the ancient narrative, the weighing of the nations, the belief that entire societies, not just individuals, stand accountable for their collective decisions, their treatment of the vulnerable, and their use of power. The opening of the court is the moment the world stops. The weighing of the nations is the moment the world listens. When ancient writers described the final judgment, they did not imagine isolated individuals drifting before a divine throne in a line stretching into eternity. They imagined nations, entire peoples, cultures, empires, tribes, and historical communities standing together in a single moment of revelation. This was not poetic exaggeration. It was a core conviction of ancient Jewish and early Christian thought. Humanity is not only judged as individuals, but as collective societies, because no person lives independent of the world that shapes them. Ancient Israel understood this intuitively. Families, clans, tribes, and nations formed the basic structure of their world. Identity was communal. Responsibility was shared. The actions of kings shaped the destiny of their people. The behavior of the populace influenced the moral trajectory of the land. When judgment came to Israel through invasion, famine, or exile, the prophets did not interpret these events as random disasters. They interpreted them as national consequences, shared accountability for shared structures of injustice. This worldview forms the foundation for understanding why the final judgment must include the weighing of nations. It is not enough to judge individuals, because individuals do not act in a vacuum. They are shaped by cultures, economies, governments, and historical forces. The collective moral identity of nations must be evaluated as well. To explore this idea, we must begin with the ancient prophetic literature, which is filled with oracles against nations: Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, Edom, Moab, Tyre, Sidon, Philistia, and more. These oracles do not condemn individuals for personal sin. They confront national pride, systemic injustice, military aggression, exploitation of the vulnerable, and imperial violence. The prophets speak of nations being weighed in the balance, evaluated according to how they used power, how they treated strangers, how they administered justice, and how they responded to divine instruction. One of the most striking examples appears in the writings of the prophet Amos, who denounces nations for atrocities in war, ripping open pregnant women, selling communities into slavery, desecrating the dead, and pursuing conquest without restraint. These are not private sins, they are national actions, and Amos presents God as holding nations accountable for these choices, even when individuals within those nations objected or disagreed. This raises a difficult but essential question. How can individuals be held responsible for the actions of their nation if they were not personally involved? Ancient Jews answered this question through the concept of collective identity, not collective guilt. They believed nations form moral ecosystems, environments that shape the actions, values, and possibilities of individuals. A person raised in a violent empire is not automatically guilty of imperial violence, but they are shaped by it, influenced by it, and often benefit from it. Ancient writers distinguished between participation and influence. Participation brings guilt, influence brings context. This distinction allowed ancient Jews to affirm both individual responsibility and national accountability. The final judgment evaluates both levels because perfect justice requires both. Early Christians adopted the same worldview. They spoke of nations as entities with spiritual character, some violent, some proud, some humble, some receptive to truth. They described spiritual forces influencing nations, not demons in a mythological sense, but patterns of injustice, corruption, idolatry, and cruelty that become embedded in cultures across generations. They believed these patterns must be addressed in the final tribunal. One early Christian text describes nations standing before the judge with their histories laid bare, as if each nation's story, its laws, wars, cultural values, and treatment of the vulnerable becomes a testimony at the final court. Another text speaks of nations being healed, not destroyed, suggesting that The final judgment is meant not only to expose wrongdoing, but also to purify and restore cultures. This concept becomes even clearer when we examine Jewish apocalyptic writings. In texts like Menjad Enoch and 2 Esdras, nations are depicted as having destinies determined by their collective actions. Empires that oppressed, exploited, or corrupted are brought to account. But righteous nations, those that upheld justice, welcomed the stranger, protected the weak, and sought peace, are honored. Again, this is not individual salvation, it is national evaluation. Archaeology provides remarkable context for this worldview. In the ancient Near East, kings often boasted of their national achievements, conquests, monument building, administration of justice, and care for the poor. Royal inscriptions from Mesopotamia emphasize the king's role as protector of widows and orphans. Egyptian pharaohs describe themselves as upholder of Ma'at, the cosmic order of truth and justice. These inscriptions reveal that ancient cultures understood governance as moral responsibility. Nations were not merely political entities, they were ethical beings. Israel shared this view but redirected it. They believed God, not kings, was the ultimate evaluator, and they believed the final accounting of nations had not yet come. It would occur only when the heavenly court opened. To grasp the full significance of this moment, imagine the entire human story, visible at once. Every empire, tribe, kingdom, republic, and civilization standing in a single space, resurrected and present. The decisions of kings are confronted. The resistance of the oppressed is honored. The moral weight of political structures is evaluated. Ancient writers imagined this moment not as chaos, but as solemn order. Nations stand as though called to testify. Their histories are opened. Their actions become transparent. The oppressed give voice to their suffering. The powerful face the consequences of their choices. Every national idol, from militarism to greed to prejudice, is exposed for what it truly was. In Jewish tradition, this is often described as the gathering of the nations. In early Christian writing, it becomes the judgment of the nations. In both cases, the concepts are aligned. Nations are evaluated for how they shape the lives of their people. Here are the key criteria by which nations were believed to be weighed in the final judgment. 1. Justice administered or denied. Ancient writers condemned nations that oppressed the vulnerable, manipulated courts, or favored the wealthy. They praised nations that upheld fairness, protected the poor, and honored the dignity of all people. 2. Use of power. Empires were judged for how they waged war, expanded territory, treated captives, and used military force. Aggression, cruelty, and conquest were seen as moral failures. 3. Economic systems. Nations were evaluated according to how they managed wealth, land, and labor. Exploitation, slavery, and economic injustice were severe charges in ancient prophetic oracles. 4. Treatment of strangers and refugees. Hospitality was a central virtue in ancient Israel. Nations that welcomed foreigners were praised. Nations that mistreated or exploited them were condemned. 5. Idolatry and corrupt cultural values. In ancient Jewish worldview, idolatry meant more than worshiping statues. It meant dedicating national identity to power, wealth, violence, or empire. Nations built on such values were seen as morally unstable. 6. Protection of the vulnerable, the poor, widows, orphans, and the oppressed stood at the center of Israel's moral vision. Nations were judged by how they treated the least protected. Ancient Jews believed nations accumulate moral momentum, patterns of justice or injustice that shape generations. These patterns cannot be evaluated by individual lives alone. They must be weighed collectively. Early Christians reinforced this concept with profound clarity. They described the final judgment as a moment when nations bring their glory, the sum of their cultural achievements, into the renewed world, but only after these achievements have been purified by divine fire. This suggests that nations are not simply condemned or saved, they are transformed. Their contributions to humanity are refined, their corruptions are removed. This brings us to a crucial insight. The weighing of the nations is not the end of nations, it is the cleansing of them. The ancient world did not imagine a future where national identity disappears. They imagined a world where nations are healed. This belief appears vividly in prophetic visions of a future age, where nations walk in the light of the renewed creation, learning peace rather than war, honoring justice rather than domination, flourishing in harmony rather than conflict. But justice must come first. Healing requires exposure. Renewal requires accountability. This accountability happens not in a corner of history, but at the center of it, in the cosmic courtroom opened in Part 7. Once nations are weighed, the next stage of the final judgment unfolds, the fire that reveals. This fire is not destruction, but disclosure, a purifying flame that exposes the true nature of every life, every work, every structure. It is the most misunderstood aspect of ancient eschatology, but also one of the most profound. The weighing of the nations prepares the world for revelation. The fire reveals what the weighing could not. Ancient Jewish and early Christian writers believed something astonishing about the final judgment. Its defining force is not the sword, not an army, not a cosmic catastrophe, but fire. Not fire as destruction, but fire as revelation. A flame that does not merely burn, but exposes. A fire that does not consume the world, but unmasks it. This idea appears across centuries of Jewish literature and becomes central in early Christianity. Yet it is one of the most misunderstood concepts in modern imagination. People picture apocalyptic fire as blazing infernos, volcanic eruptions, or divine wrath scorching the earth. But ancient sources describe something far more profound. A fire of truth, a fire that reveals the essence of every life, every nation, every structure of the world. To understand this, we must begin with the ancient symbolism of fire. In the world of the Bible, fire had three primary functions. 1. Fire purifies. Metallurgists used fire to separate gold from impurities. Temples used fire to cleanse objects for sacred use. Fire was the tool that removed corruption and clarified substance. 2. Fire reveals. In darkness, fire exposes what is hidden. It allows people to see what they could not see before. Fire unmasks. Fire illuminates. 3. Fire judges. In the ancient Near East, trial by fire existed both literally and symbolically. People believed fire could reveal guilt or innocence by exposing hidden truth. These three functions, purification, revelation, judgment, converge in the ancient concept of divine fire. But what makes the final judgment remarkable is how writers used fire imagery not for destruction, but for clarity. The prophets, the sages, the apostolic writers all describe a moment when fire passes through creation and reveals what is real, what is false, what is eternal, and what was only illusion. This is not fire that consumes forests. It is fire that consumes lies. It does not burn down the world. It burns away what corrupts the world. To understand this ancient worldview, we must examine the sources. Fire in the prophetic tradition. In prophetic literature, fire represents the presence of God. When Moses encounters God, it is through fire that does not consume. When Elijah stands on the mountain, fire reveals divine authority. When the prophets speak of the day, they describe it as a fire that exposes injustice, not annihilates creation. One prophet says that God will be like a refiner's fire, not a wildfire. The language is deliberate. The purpose is purification. Early Jewish teachers interpreted these passages as symbolic statements about a future moment when God's presence would reveal the truth of every life and every society. They believed nothing could withstand divine light except what was genuinely good. Everything else, hypocrisy, corruption, spiritual decay, would dissolve the way impurities melt away from gold. Fire is not the enemy of the world. Fire is the enemy of falsehood. Fire in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain references to a final cleansing, not of bodies, but of truth. One scroll describes a light of purity that exposes the works of darkness. Another speaks of a furnace of testing, where deeds are shown for what they truly are. These texts do not describe deletion of humanity, but the exposure of humanity. Their fire is moral, not physical. In one fragment, the writer says that the righteous shine with the eternal glory, while the deeds of the wicked turn to smoke before the face of the Holy One. Notice the imagery, not people turning to smoke, but deeds. What is false cannot endure. What is true remains. Fire in early Christian teaching. Early Christian writers deepen this concept. They describe the final judgment as a moment when fire tests the quality of every life. One writer says that each person's works will be revealed by fire, and the fire will show what sort of work it is. Here again, the language focuses not on burning people, but on revealing deeds. It is the character of a life that passes through flame. Another early text describes humanity standing before God as fire sweeps through creation, exposing the truth behind every action, motive, and hidden intention. Yet the writer emphasizes that this fire is not arbitrary punishment. It is the unveiling of what each person has truly built. The righteous survive the flame not because they are sinless, but because their lives contain something real, something aligned with truth. This idea became foundational in early Christian theology. Judgment is revelation. Fire is clarity. Fire is cosmic illumination, not cosmic destruction. Modern apocalyptic imagination often envisions the end of the world in catastrophic terms: meteors, explosions, cosmic annihilation. But ancient Jews and Christians believed the opposite. They believed the world would be renewed, not obliterated. Fire does not consume the earth, it transforms it. Ancient writings describe a renewed creation, a restored world, free from death, violence, and decay. If fire annihilated everything, nothing could be renewed. The very existence of a new world requires that fire be understood as purification, not destruction. This is why early writers emphasize that creation itself is not the target of divine anger. Evil is, corruption is, injustice is. Fire removes what prevents creation from flourishing. Think of it like the clearing of a wound, painful but healing, or the burning away of infection, intense but restorative. The ancient world understood this intuitively. They saw fire used by priests to cleanse, by craftsmen to refine, by shepherds to protect flocks. Fire was not merely a symbol of wrath, it was a tool of renewal. Fire and the books of remembrance. In earlier parts of this story, we explored the books of remembrance, the moral archives of the universe. Fire interacts directly with these records. Ancient writers believed that when fire passes through creation, it does so with full knowledge of the truth. Fire does not guess, it reveals. It is guided by what is written. In one early text, fire is described as the servant of truth. In another, it is called the spirit of purification. These descriptions reappear in early Christian commentary, where divine fire is seen not as an uncontrolled force, but as the active presence of God making truth visible. This fits perfectly with the structure of the final judgment. The books record the truth. The court reveals the truth. The fire exposes the truth. Judgment is not guesswork, it is unveiling. Fire and nations. Just as individuals pass through the fire of revelation, so do nations. Ancient Jewish thought envisioned entire cultures being purified, their violence exposed, their injustice confronted, their achievements refined. Nations do not simply vanish, they are transformed. In one prophetic vision, nations bring their glory into the renewed world, but only after passing through fire. This glory refers not to military conquests, but to cultural contributions, art, wisdom, language, and communal identity. The fire removes the corruption of nations and leaves only what enriches the human family. Ancient writers did not believe in a monocultural afterlife. They believed in diversity renewed, cultures purified, nations restored. Fire plays a central role in that transformation. Fire as personal revelation. Ancient Jews believed that the moment a person stands before God, there is nowhere to hide. Fire represents that moment of naked truth, the moment when every mask falls. It is not punishment, it is recognition. The fire reveals the self that was always there. Early Christian writers describe this moment as both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because illusions vanish, liberating because truth sets free. They emphasize that no one escapes this fire. No life remains unexamined. No hidden motive escapes exposure. But they also emphasize that fire does not erase identity. It reveals it. People do not cease to exist because of their flaws. They face them. The fire shows what their lives were truly made of. For some, this exposure is painful. For others, it is glorious. Fire as the divider of ages in ancient worldview. Two ages existed, the present age, marked by corruption and death, and the age to come, marked by justice and life. Between these two ages stands fire, the boundary that separates the corruptible from the incorruptible. The fire does not destroy the world, it divides it. It marks the transition from what was to what will be. When the fire completes its work, nothing false remains. Creation stands purified, humanity stands revealed. The new world begins to emerge, the misunderstanding of fire as punishment. One of the greatest distortions in later history was the transformation of the ancient concept of fire into a symbol of endless torment. That idea developed centuries later, influenced by medieval imagination, art, and Dante's poetic imagery. It does not reflect the worldview of early Judaism or the earliest Christianity. For ancient writers, fire was temporary, its purpose completed when truth was revealed and the world renewed. It was not an eternal furnace, but a moment of cosmic clarity. The early church fathers consistently described divine fire as purifying, not sadistic. Even when they spoke of suffering, it was always in the context of revelation and correction, not limitless torture. In the ancient worldview, the final fire is not the end of creation. It is the beginning of creation made right. A world exposed, a world renewed. By the time ancient writers finished describing the fire of judgment, several themes emerged clearly. The fire reveals what is hidden. The fire separates truth from falsehood. The fire purifies what can be saved. The fire removes what cannot endure. The fire prepares the world for renewal. In this sense, fire is the most hopeful element of the final judgment. Without it, injustice would continue. Without it, suffering would never be healed. Without it, the renewed creation could not emerge. Fire prepares the world for its future, and now that the fire has done its work, the ancient story arrives at its final moment. The world after the verdict, the reassembled creation, the renewal of everything God intended from the beginning. This is the climax of ancient hope. This is the conclusion of the final judgment. When the final court closes, when the books of remembrance are fully opened, when the nations have been weighed, and when the fire of truth has passed through creation, the ancient writers describe something extraordinary. The world does not end, it begins. The final judgment is not the collapse of history, but the unveiling of its purpose. Not the destruction of creation, but its restoration. Not an exit from human existence, but the renewal of what it means to be human. To understand this, we must return to the worldview that shaped ancient Judaism and early Christianity. These cultures did not imagine salvation as escape. They imagined salvation as transformation. The renewed world, revealed after the verdict, was not a distant spiritual realm detached from physical life. It was this world, healed, perfected, reassembled. Everything history had broken would be restored. Everything injustice had stained would be cleansed. Everything death had taken would be returned. The finale of the ancient story begins with a single, defining moment. The verdict is spoken. This is not a list of names entering heaven or hell. That framework developed later. In ancient thought, the verdict is the pronouncement that closes the age of corruption and opens the age of renewal. It is God's final declaration that injustice will no longer rule creation. It is the moment the moral architecture of the universe is set right. The prophets described it as a great proclamation. Early Jewish writers described it as the restoration of order. Early Christians described it as the moment God becomes all in all, meaning every part of creation aligns with divine justice. Once this verdict is spoken, everything changes. The end of death. One of the most dramatic outcomes of the final judgment is the removal of death itself. Ancient Jewish and Christian texts both insist that death is an intruder, something that entered creation, but does not belong permanently. In the renewed world, death is not reinterpreted, managed, or spiritualized. It is abolished. The ancient sources speak with stunning clarity. The dead will rise, never to die again. The resurrected will be incorruptible. Decay will be impossible. Suffering will have no future. In early Christian thought, death is the final enemy defeated, not a personified being, but a force undone. Ancient Jews believed the same. Once the great judgment occurs, death itself loses dominion. Archaeology echoes this hope. Funeral inscriptions across Judea often speak of life everlasting, awakening at the end, and rising at the time of restoration. These messages were not poetic comfort. They were declarations of faith in a deathless future, the healing of creation. Ancient Israel believed the land itself carried the scars of human behavior, fields ravaged by war, mountains carved by empire, rivers polluted by violence. All of these were considered imprints of moral decay. Early Christian writers inherited this belief and expanded it. Creation groans under the weight of human corruption, longing for the day of renewal. When the fire of revelation completes its work, creation is healed. This healing appears in prophetic literature as symbolic imagery. Deserts blooming, waters flowing, predators losing aggression. These images symbolize peace, stability, and moral restoration. But they also convey something deeper, a world reconnected with its creator, functioning as designed. Ancient Jews described this as shalom, not simply peace, but completeness, wholeness, flourishing. A world where everything exists in right relationship. Humans with God, humans with each other, humans with creation, creation within itself. Early Christians called it the new creation, not a replacement world, but this world renewed. The renewal of humanity. Resurrected humanity is not disembodied or ghost-like. It is embodied, permanent, and transformed. In the ancient imagination, human beings in the renewed world have incorruptible bodies, unbroken relationships, purified motives, clarity of mind and heart. This transformation is not the erasure of identity. It is the fulfillment of identity. The ancient writers insisted that each person remains themselves, recognizable, continuous, complete, but removed from everything that distorted them. Imagine a human life without fear, without shame, without cruelty, without insecurity. That is the portrait ancient texts paint. The renewed world is not populated by idealized abstractions. It is populated by people restored to their true selves. The nations restored. One of the most profound elements of the final judgment is that nations do not disappear. They are purified, renewed, brought into harmony. The prophetic vision does not describe one culture dominating others, nor a blending of nations into a single global identity. Instead, it describes nations walking in light, bringing their glory into the renewed world, learning peace instead of war, healed relationships replacing centuries of conflict. This idea is astonishing. The final judgment does not erase diversity, it redeems it. Every tongue, culture, and heritage becomes part of the renewed creation. The violence, prejudice, and injustice that once divided nations are removed by the fire of revelation. What remains is the unique beauty each nation contributed to humanity. Ancient writers saw nations as choirs, not armies, voices joined in harmony, not locked in conflict. The vindication of the victims. Across millennia, the suffering of the innocent has raised a single haunting question. Will their pain be remembered, or will it be swallowed by history? Ancient Judaism answered firmly. It will be remembered. It will be addressed. It will be healed. The final judgment is the moment when the stories of victims, silenced by empire, crushed by injustice, forgotten by history, rise into the center of the world's attention. Their suffering becomes testimony. Their tears become evidence. Their dignity is restored openly, publicly, in the presence of all creation. Early Christian writers emphasize this repeatedly. The judge sides with the oppressed, the broken, the marginalized, not sentimentally, but justly. Every injustice that history failed to correct is corrected in the final tribunal. There is no corruption in this court, no cover-ups, no political maneuvering, no forgotten victims. Everything rises, everything is seen, everything is answered. The collapse of evil. In ancient thought, evil is not a rival power to God. It is a parasite, a distortion that drains life. The final judgment removes this parasite permanently. Evil collapses not because God crushes it violently, but because the fire of truth leaves it nothing to stand on. Ancient Jewish texts describe this moment as the purging of wickedness, a moral cleansing that allows creation to flourish. Early Christian texts describe it as the end of corruption, the removal of every force that opposes life. In the renewed world, evil has no habitat, no foothold, no shadow in which to hide. The world is not engineered to prevent evil. It is transformed so that evil is impossible. This is not coercion, it is restoration. The unveiling of God's presence. In the renewed creation, God's presence is no longer hidden behind symbols, rituals, or sacred spaces. Ancient Jews describe this as the removal of the veil, the moment humanity sees clearly what it had only glimpsed before. Early Christians described it as dwelling with God openly, immediately, fully. This does not mean humans become absorbed into divinity. Ancient writers rejected that idea. Instead, they envisioned proximity, restored relationship, unbroken communion, and direct encounter. What humanity experienced in fragments, visions, and whispers becomes continuous reality. The endless future. The final theme of ancient eschatology is perhaps the most mysterious. The future does not end. The renewed world is not static. It is dynamic, expansive, unfolding. Ancient texts describe nations journeying, learning, building, creating. Human beings grow, explore, and deepen in wisdom. Creation flourishes indefinitely. There is no death to interrupt the story, no corruption to unravel it, no injustice to distort it. The final age is eternal, not simply in duration, but in quality. It is life without decay, joy without shadow, existence without fear. A final reflection. Why this hope endured. The ancient world was brutal. Empires rose and fell through violence. The weak suffered. The powerful escaped consequences. Entire civilizations vanished into dust. Yet, across millennia, Jewish and Christian communities held to this hope, that history does not end in despair, but in restoration. This hope was not naive. It was forged in suffering. It was shaped by exile, persecution, and oppression. It survived because it answered the deepest human longing, that justice must prevail, that life must triumph, that meaning must endure. The final judgment was not fear for them, it was hope. A world made right, a creation restored, a future without death. When the verdict is spoken, humanity does not vanish. Humanity begins. This is the vision of the ancient texts. This is the world after the verdict, the end.